Almost every person on the wasteland is a survivor. From experiments to chamber rooms, escaping from monsters, still most of their deaths were inevitable. But some lived to see the wasteland. So what actually happened to every forgotten survivor? Starting with one that we don't even know his name, Mr. Hildenbrand, the mayor. This is a story as sad as it is ambiguous. We know well that in Fallout, nothing is ever purely black and white. There are nuances, the lines are blurred, and a man's true nature can only be judged by our own personal moral standards, often requiring us to make 1,000 compromises or surrender to evidence that we cannot express a definitive and unquestionable judgment. This is the case of Hildenbrand, the last mayor of Boston. We have no surviving documentation regarding his given name, so we will only know him by his surname. Let's begin by explaining what Hildenbrand held most dear. For such an ambiguous politician, we might imagine a certain attachment to money or power. But Hildenbrand actually put his family first. No matter the means employed or the compromises made, everything was done for the well-being of his wife and 2 daughters. An exemplary father, we might say. But some men draw a circle around themselves to encompass everything they hold dear, only to exploit or even sacrifice everything left outside. Amassing wealth by exploiting his position was never a problem for the mayor, and if it served to provide a luxurious life for his family, even corruption, coercion, and embezzlement were not a moral problem for him. He had often made backroom deals with various multinational corporations to keep their illicit activities under wraps in exchange for huge bribes, such as when he promoted a fishing tournament in honor of Independence Day, knowing full well that the lake where it was held was heavily polluted by the illegal dumping of industrial waste by several large local corporations. Or when he pressured the Faneuil Hall board to purchase a batch of Protectron robots from Robco, despite knowing full well about the problems posed by the robots' operating systems. He never openly commented on the horrific incident in which those same Protectrons massacred 7 people in the market, mistakenly identifying them as shoplifters. So, given this perspective, we shouldn't be surprised by his actions when the first news of an escalation in the Sino-American conflict began to arrive. Naturally, Hildenbrand didn't think of his own city or his fellow citizens. He thought first and foremost of his family. So he gathered all the public funds he could divert without arousing too much suspicion and used them to build a bunker, a survival refuge that would protect him, his family, and a small number of collaborators chosen to ensure their safety. When the fateful day arrived, Hildenbrand had already calculated everything. His family was picked up in time, and before the city of Boston was destroyed, they were already safely underground. The bunker had been built with the intention of protecting the mayor's family for the long term, but no expense had been spared to make it as luxurious and comfortable as possible. Under the direction of Hildenbrand's wife, a woman accustomed to the comforts of life, a home theater, a fully equipped gym, a minibar, and even a fireplace were installed inside, along with spacious rooms on multiple levels and a pantry that could have fed them for years. Essentially, a shelter that could easily have housed dozens of refugees, but instead had been designed for the comfort of a single family. At first, everything seemed to be going well. With the entrance sealed and guards protecting them, the Hildenbrands were ready to face the nuclear winter that awaited the nation in comfort, ready to rise with it as soon as the situation stabilized. But the situation escalated far more quickly than the mayor could have foreseen. Somehow, within the first few weeks of the Great War, a large number of survivors learned of the mayor's secret hideout. With their backs against the wall and not knowing who else to turn to, the crowd headed for the door, seeking help from the man who was supposed to be protecting and guiding them through that grave crisis. However, Hildenbrand was adamant. It was unthinkable to host such a mob. The shelter had been designed solely for his family, and he wouldn't risk their safety to lend a hand to that group of stragglers. After all, he felt strong and safe in his concrete bunker, surrounded by armed bodyguards. However, when the mayor's door was slammed in their faces, they didn't retreat with their tails between their legs, as the man had predicted. What he hadn't calculated was that he was facing desperate people who had lost literally everything in the bombing and who now feared not the weapons, but the desperation and hunger that the nuclear fallout would soon bring. Driven by these thoughts, the Bostonians began to smash the shelter's entrance until they even managed to breach it and enter the bunker. Hildenbrand, taken aback by such blind fury, could do nothing but reorganize his defenses. After all, he still had the weapons and was protected by layer upon layer of concrete shelter. No matter how enraged these people were, they couldn't handle a battle of attrition. Sooner or later, pressed harassed by hunger and the hail of bullets, they would give up, or so he thought. The days spent maintaining that siege only served to embitter the rebels. The group was not completely disarmed, and by conquering room after room, they even managed to get their hands on some of the enemy's weapons. Furthermore, seeing the luxury with which that place had been built only fueled the fire, which soon became clearly impossible to put out. As he approached the wall, Hildenbrand realized there was only one way to save his family. He knew that if the madwoman got her hands on him, his wife, and his children, it would end badly for everyone. So he decided to make a desperate choice, a decision that only a truly devoted man could have made. Following a strategy meeting with his remaining bodyguards, Hildenbrand secretly made his way to his bathroom. He locked himself in and, after filling the tub, immersed himself in it with a radio on, electrocuting himself. He left behind only a holotape recording for his wife, and expressing his love for her and their children, and instructing her to hand his body over to the rioters, hoping that his cowardly death would calm their spirits and allow them to escape unharmed. Unfortunately, this sacrifice was entirely in vain. The mayor's body was found first by his bodyguards, who simply decided to lock the bathroom door and keep the secret from his wife, so she wouldn't learn of the man's horrific end. At that point, everyone knew the situation was no longer manageable and that the mob would soon prevail thanks to its fury and superior numbers. However, they were trained men and would not back down from the task of protecting the rest of the mayor's family. The woman and the two girls were then taken to the lowest point of the structure, the gym equipment room, where they were told to wait for the situation to resolve and for Hildenbrand himself to come and get them. This handful of guards then formed a last line of defense, ready to face the tide that was pushing into the shelter minute by minute. Before the crowd managed to break through these last defenses and reach the lower levels, Hildenbrand's wife also recorded a holotape for her husband, unaware of his already deceased state. In the message, she apologized to the man for forcing him to spend too much money on the construction of that shelter, and that she was ready to hand the bunker over to the rebels in exchange for the safety of the entire family. In any case, as long as they remained united, they could survive even in the outside world. Her final words were intended to calm the panicked girls. Here the message ends, and we don't know exactly what happened next. But one thing is certain: when the protagonist descends into the shelter during the game, inside he finds the remains not only of many rebels and the mayor's bodyguards, but also those of Hildenbrand himself and his entire family. Randall Clark, the survivalist. Clark's is an epic story, which would be worthy of a true protagonist of the series. He is the figure of a dark and solitary anti-hero who faces his destiny despite the 1,000 obstacles that it continues to throw at him. As with everyone in that period, we can start his narrative on the day the bombs fell. Clark had been a United States soldier before the Great War, but his true pride lay not in his skills as a fighter, but rather in those of a survivalist. He loved nature and wilderness. Adapting to extreme situations in isolated terrain was literally his pastime, so much so that it led him to regularly travel away from Salt Lake City and his family to spend a couple of days alone in Zion Canyon. And he was just on his way home from one of his solo camping weekends that fateful day. His car stopped suddenly, and so did the one in the adjacent lane. All electronic equipment suddenly stopped working, and it didn't take Clark, with his experience as a soldier, long to recognize the characteristics of an EMP. He immediately understood that something was about to happen, something serious. Without further hesitation, he sought shelter and had just in time to find it when bombs began raining from the sky. The bombing lasted 7 minutes with 13 nuclear warheads exploding. Yeah, when everything stopped and the man was able to come out of his hiding place, what he found in front of him was a chilling sight of Salt Lake City, which just a short while before had been visible not far away towards the horizon. Now there was nothing left but craters and a few smoking rubble. Clark lost everything that day: his family, his home, and all the people he knew. But he was a soldier and a survival expert. He decided to try to carry on, and after recovering what he could carry of his equipment, headed back towards Zion Canyon. Here he managed to find refuge in the deep caves that ran along the entire length of the canyon. Fortunately, he also managed to recover some survival material left in the area by the United States Geological Survey, including supplies of water and food. He barely had time to set up his camp when a heavy black rain began to torment the valley. The Geiger counter was clear. It was radioactive fallout, and at levels never seen before. Months passed before a strong storm swept away the clouds and washed away some of the effects of the rain, allowing man to finally go outside and see the sun again. But at that point, the reality of things was clear. He was alone, facing a new hostile world completely in ruins, and he had no choice but to call upon all the skills honed in those years to rebuild a new life. if it was really worth it. Years passed, and Clark adopted the canyon as his new home. He found plants that had mutated but remained edible, began to hunt the bighorn sheep that over time flocked to the valley, and essentially managed to establish a peaceful and regular, albeit solitary, Ans's lifestyle. The first human contact since the beginning of the Great War occurred in 2095, when a small group of Hispanics arrived in Zion looking for a safe place to settle. At first, Clark stood aside, trying not to reveal his presence but preferring to study the new arrivals from afar. They were Mexicans, small families with lots of children, peaceful people, and therefore the man decided to take them under his wing by providing them with support and even medicine. Unfortunately, this happy coexistence did not last long. Just a year later, another group reached the canyon. They were strange people, armed and wearing bizarre blue overalls, with a big .22 drawn on them. They were vault dwellers, but neither Clark nor the Mexicans could know this. Many of them were clearly ill with what was mistaken for typhus, but the reality was much worse. As in a spore, a secret experiment by Vault-Tec had infected them, making them extremely violent and not very inclined to bargain. It didn't take long for the two factions to clash with the Mexicans, practically unarmed and outnumbered, who got the worst of it. With the intent of bringing the few survivors to safety, Clark descended from his refuge to infiltrate the enemy camp. But unfortunately, when he arrived on site, he discovered a horrible reality. In fact, the spore had made the inhabitants of the vault cannibals, and now there was nothing left of the prisoners. Struck by horror and a deep desire for revenge, the former soldier began a real war against the monsters who had destroyed his friends. In less than a year, between ambushes and lethal traps, he had managed to exterminate more than 80 invaders. The few remaining, and you're realizing that they did not have the numbers nor the skills to face that mysterious figure, decided to abandon the valley, and nothing more was heard of them. Now Clark was alone again, but this situation did not last long. A few months passed before another traveler appeared in Zion. Her name was Sylvie, and she too was a survivor of Vault 22. But unlike her old companions, she had not been infected by the spore, and for this reason she had preferred to move away from them, worried about the effects that the disease was having on their psyche. Clark welcomed the woman, and, after treating her from a serious wound, allowed her to stay with him. Over time, the relationship evolved into a feeling of love, and shortly afterwards, the beautiful Sylvie became pregnant. Randall was shocked by the news, but wanted everything to turn out well. She went out into the outside world to gather everything she might need for the baby's birth, and even studied some texts she had found regarding pregnancy and childbirth. Everything seemed to be ready, but bad luck just didn't want to abandon the man. The birth immediately proved extremely difficult. The baby was breech, and despite Clark's best efforts and studies, both baby and mother ultimately lost their lives in the process. Having lost his family again, the man buried them and then retreated to his camp ready to end it all. But he couldn't. He was a survivor, and it didn't seem honorable to him to voluntarily abandon that life from which all his loved ones had been forcibly taken away. As he had always done, he got up, reorganized himself, and decided once again to move forward in the name of those who were no longer there. 10 years passed, and the now 70-year-old Randall Clark couldn't believe his eyes when a new small group took its first hesitant steps inside the canyon. To his great surprise, what he found in front of him were children, none older than 14. Many were certainly younger. They settled in the same camp used by the Mexicans years before, and just as he had done with them, Clark decided to help that new little colony. Still without revealing his presence, he listened to their conversations and discovered that they were escapees from a place called the School, what we know to be nothing more than one of Vault-Tec's many cruel experiments. In any case, he helped them by providing medicine, food, and advice without ever showing himself openly. Over time, for those young people, he became an almost mythological figure, and they began to call him the Father and considered him a kind of protective spirit who inhabited the surrounding caves. Unfortunately, this pleasant coexistence also did not last long. Within a year, Clark fell ill, probably with cancer, and felt that death was finally coming to him too. So he left his final farewell notes with the kids, and having gathered a few essential things, headed towards a pass near one of the canyon entrances. Here he established a bed with difficulty, now too weak to do anything else. He lay down wrapped in a blanket, and with his trusty rifle still in his hands, and began to observe the sky becoming dark and then covered with stars. Thinking back to his past life, to his Zion left in the hands of a new generation, and to those waiting for him on the other side, Randall Clark fell asleep in his last rock bed, never to wake up again. John Elwood, the scientist. Surviving the bombs isn't always everything. There are stories where survival has become a curse, when trying everything to save yourself and the people around you wasn't enough. Instead, it turned into a true curse. John Elwood is an example of how, in Fallout, staying alive offers no guarantees. John was an ambitious man, and this ambition of his began to take hold since his time at the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, where he met his future wife, Erica Woolham, and what would become his closest friend and close collaborator, Wilfred Bergman. Once their studies were completed, the group immediately decided they wanted to go into business and work seriously on their projects. So together they founded Cambridge Polymer Labs, now a company aimed at developing new super-resistant materials for the war industry. The first successes began to arrive, and Elwood's interpersonal skills brought the company under the watchful eye of the Ministry of Defense in the person of Colonel George Kemp, who decided to directly finance their new studies. This soon led them to collaborate closely even with ultra-secret government projects such as the development of the giant robot Liberty Prime. Finally, they were even assigned the Nucleostrictive Lining Project, a program of extreme interest for the defense, which involved the creation of a new material for the construction of power armor, which would, in theory, have allowed the suit to convert the ionized radiation present in the surrounding environment and transform it into electrical energy, with the aim of self-powering. Development was underway, although there were many snags in designing such a revolutionary material. But then came the fateful day, the falling of the bombs. That same day, before the disaster struck, Elwood received a disturbing call from Colonel Kemp in which the soldier pressed for the completion of the project and urged not to let the research staff leave the laboratory building for any reason. When the first explosions occurred, Elwood understood that Kemp's had been a cryptic warning of what was to come. Elwood, desperate for the situation, opted for an extreme solution. He sealed the building where his collaborators were located, forcing them to work non-stop in an attempt to finalize the development of the new material. The secret about the fall of the bombs was kept, for fear that the staff, in panic, would decide to stop working. The ready excuse was the intense exercises underway by the army. Meanwhile, Elwood himself, unable to contact the colonel again due to the damage caused to the communication system by the bombs, decided to take the risk of going out into the outside world and recovering a radio. The reconnaissance was successful, but the man was grazed by a stray bullet and, what's worse, he was unfortunately also hit against his will by an extremely large amount of radiation. Once the device was activated, he attempted to contact the military forces. He couldn't find Kemp, but what the soldiers told him made his blood run cold. The orders left by the colonel were indeed to organize rescue groups, but given the current emergency situation, these rescues would have been guaranteed only and exclusively to those personnel who would have proven to be strictly indispensable to support the war effort. The message was clear. Prove you can complete the new power armor material or save yourself. Unable to do anything else, Elwood continued his lie by forcing his collaborators in extra work to achieve his goal and finally be saved. The only other person he told the truth to was his wife Erica, but in any case, the news could not be contained for long. Soon his friend Wilfred Bergman discovered a serious radiation leak in the laboratory, a problem that, he discovered, Elwood was already aware of but had kept silent about so as not to distract the researchers from their work. In an attempt to stem the problem, Bergman sealed the chamber containing the isotope that was supposed to be the basis for the new material. Unfortunately, during the trial, she also locked up a colleague, thus condemning her to certain death. In the throes of guilt, the man turned against his old friend, placing all the blame for the accident on him, and accusing him of keeping secrets from him and the rest of the scientists. Thus began a real attempt to depose the tyrant by convincing some of the researchers present to rebel against Elwood, and then proceeding with a series of hacker attacks on the laboratory system in an attempt to gain control of it. Elwood somehow managed to repel the first assaults, but was now extremely debilitated from the radiation and the wound that was becoming infected. Now convinced that he was about to die, he left a final message to his wife, hoping that she and the rest of the collaborators would be able to overpower Bergman and complete the project so they could be saved. But in the world of Fallout, most of the time they go wrong. Bergman's small force action led to several deaths among scientists. Even once the man was stopped, the damage had been done. The chamber with the isotope was sealed, and no one could access it anymore, and the project could not be completed. What we know today is the unhappy fate of most of those present. It is not known whether some of them had the courage to venture into the outside world, but many certainly died inside the structure. Ultimately, the loss of radiation was not stopped by the isolation of the isotope, but was only slowed down, was so much so that many of those present suffered high levels of contamination. In the contemporary world of the game, the structure is a dilapidated and ruined place. Machinery and documents are still scattered throughout the various areas, and only a certain number of feral ghouls still inhabit these places. Sadly, if we manage to reach Elwood's office, we will find him still there, also transformed into a ghoul by the large dose of radiation he had absorbed in an attempt to recover the radio. This is what remains of the survivors of Cambridge Polymer Labs, Dasa Ben Ami, the Responder. Fortunately, there is one certainty in this world: counterbalance. We know that the world of Fallout is a bleak, dark world, full of moral gray areas where it's impossible to say whether someone acted for good or evil. Many characters, I'm subjected to the despair of the Great War, did everything to stay alive. They made horrible choices, becoming bandits, tyrants, murderers. When you have nothing left to lose, everything seems permissible, but this isn't the case for everyone. There are people, however, who have never lost hope, who, like a beacon in the fog, have decided to lend a hand to those who were lost, and who have understood that surviving alone is worthless. We must be united. We must be able to be the best we can, so that we can rebuild a life not of mere subsistence, but of true happiness. Survive to live, not the other way around. Dasa was a final-year anthropology student at Vault-Tec University. He was writing his final thesis when the Great War began. His father was a Vault-Tec employee, and, in theory, he and his family had the right to enter Vault 76. However, once they arrived on site, the guards were clear. Only 2 places were available for their family. Despite her father's heated protests, Dasa convinced him to take her younger brother and enter the vault with him. He had to force them into the entrance to get them to go, but it was right. Only he could take care of the boy. So Dasa, now alone, decided to return to her home in Charleston, where she simply survived. He found food and resources, survived the radioactivity, and when things calmed down, he also found a purpose to carry on. He joined the Responders, an organized group of survivors who had only one goal: to rebuild. Together with his companions, Dasa helped numerous people to get their homes and lives back on their feet. They settled in the small town of Flatwoods, where they managed to compose an appearance of normal life. It wasn't much, but it had value. Here, Dasa had an idea that would prove useful in more than one sense, collecting the testimonies of the people he met. Everyone had something to say. Everyone had knowledge that could be useful to the community, but above all, everyone needed someone to talk to and vent. So the girl began collecting interviews on holotapes. Apparently, the information gathered was mostly advice from expert people who would certainly be useful in the new life they were building. A survivalist who advised on the best way to build a camp and how to make it safe, a priest with a deep knowledge of herbs and their effects, and a former researcher who knew how to manage water resources and how to make sure the water was as uncontaminated as possible before drinking it. Everyone could add a piece of the puzzle. So much so that, in the end, Dasa's project transformed into a real archive available to responders to manage the most varied situations. But, as mentioned, this work was also useful in different ways. Not all those interviewed were responders like her. Many were ordinary citizens who hovered in the organization's orbit, who lent a hand, or who simply lived near Flatwoods. And they all had one thing in common. They were survivors. They had all been through the same hell, and talking about what they had seen was just as helpful as knowing how to keep going. People remained isolated for years before the radiation faded, and some lost in the mountains with all the dangers that entailed. People who had lost their families, their homes, and had dragged themselves until they found someone ready to lend a hand. Others who, despite their desperation, had rolled up their sleeves and taken on everyone's difficulties, trying to bring the world back to a state somewhat similar to the one they had always known. Dasa and his recordings became a way for them to face tragedy and move forward, a way to understand that not everything was over, and that there was still much that could be done. According to the records we come into possession of during the game, Dasa will archive her last holotape in 2096, and will die sometime between that date and 2010-2. By then, she will have become the leader of the Responders Flatwoods post, having practically spent the last 20 years of her life helping people. And that was what happened to every forgotten survivor. If you want to see Fallout 4's most disturbing mysteries explained, click the video on the screen.